بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله على دين الإسلام وتوفيق الإيمان والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I'm very pleased to be with you this afternoon and have the opportunity of sharing some of my views and ideas on what education is in Islam. Obviously, we are here all, I believe, interested in education in Islam, either as parents or as students or as teachers. The key thing is, how do we teach Islam, how do we communicate different aspects of Islam and Islamic values. So education seems to be our passion, particularly in the context of Islam. But often when people engage with this kind of activities, let us say they set up schools, for example, Islamic schools or madrasas or organizations, or even universities, often you find, because education is taken for granted as life, not many people are prepared to professionally reflect on what education is in Islam. So therefore, as the key actors involved in facilitating education, we might simply carry on doing things trial and error. But obviously, as we know today, education is a professional area of study, specialization, and in all fields like physics and maths and sciences, you will have people who are qualified to teach, have benchmark standards. Unfortunately, because of our own history in Europe as Muslims, we have schools, we have madrasas, we have all kinds of educational institutions, but unfortunately so far we haven't still produced professional Muslim teacher training colleges. So therefore, our products, curriculum, textbook, teaching methods, evaluation, and also the way in which we can reach to our young people in their reality today seems to be an uncharted territory. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed me with the opportunity. I'm somebody from Turkey who's in exile. I could say a Turk in exile. But there's always useful tasks for these people who are in exile. I found myself over now 10 years working with Muslim young children, originally in Birmingham, in Leicester, and then researching their faith development and the problems, and then finally trying to understand what really education is in Islam and what is really going on if we are failing to communicate Islamic values, Islamic knowledge, understanding to our young generations. And lastly, in Leicester, last 9 years, I've been teaching a master's level Islamic education program where I actually help all kinds of Muslim educators, social workers, youth workers, to actually train and understand professionally what education is in Islam. Now, I'm particularly going to focus on Islamic schooling because it's a large sector in the UK, isn't it? We have Association of Muslim Schools. Anybody from the Association of Muslim Schools? Oh, well, that tells us the whole level of interest. So AMS is not interested in NIDA's Muslim Education Fair. So obviously we have AMS, which is the largest representation of Muslim schools in the UK and Ireland as well. It's a large sector, and because of the political developments, as you know, Muslim communities have come under a huge political, if you like it, observation and monitoring. What has happened, the way in which Islamic schools are perceived to be obviously in the multicultural secular context with suspicion. So there is, in a sense, a politics, isn't it, everywhere, because human life is integrated with the vested interests and powers. So nobody is exempt from this. So in other words, whenever we have a schooling process or education, we have to realize there must be some sort of politics also present. The idea would be, in order to understand the challenges facing Islamic schooling, we should ask ourselves whose interests are served in a schooling context. And we should also ask this question in an Islamic schooling as well. Now, usually, it is either parents or it is what the adults say, or what they think is good for their children. But there will be less interest in how children feel, their experience. So usually, unfortunately, Islamic schooling, I would say, has not prioritized always the interest of the learners. And in any education, if it's going to be powerful, transformative, and change process, education must listen to the learner. Without prioritizing the learner, it's impossible to be able to communicate, shape their identities, gain their trust and confidence. Now, what is happening because of our own particular migration history? Obviously, as parents, we are concerned about the identity of our young children, their faith development, because we believe there's a secular culture, there is a negative influence on their life. So, in other words, we are concerned that our young people are unable to replicate the same identities we have borrowed from our home countries. Unfortunately, education often becomes a cultural site where parents, community leaders, certain ideologies, isn't it, are put forward, unfortunately, at the expense of ignoring how our young people feel. So that is an important dimension that we should all be aware. There must be an ethics of education, moral of education. They could be our children, but they're all, isn't it, they're on their own. We have to respect their autonomy and agency. So as a result, what happens, we have Islamic schools, we have Islamic ethos schools, but when we ask what does ethos mean, really in reality is a cultural attempt to reinscribe the identity of children in our care the way we see it. Sometimes this is good, it's done with the duty and responsibility. But when it is done in the name of Islam, this is the problem. Because then the question is, what does really Islam say about education? And often parents, teachers, even those who set up Islamic schools, they have no patience to find out what really in Islam education is all about. Now, I don't want to extend this talk, so there is a need, urgent need, to reflect back on what really education, teaching and learning is within Islamic framework. We could come up with different views, that doesn't really matter, but we have to do that exercise. Otherwise, we are simply replicating the models, the ideas we have borrowed from somewhere and simply putting down to our young people. Results are not working, this is the problem. If it worked, I would be happy. If it produces young people with good faith development, with moral attitudes, and good Islamic religiosities, I will be the first one to say you've achieved your goal. But it does not work. Our young people are alienated from Islam. I have done empirical research. I have no time to go into it. You can buy probably the book. I think they are selling it downstairs since the brother was speaking very nice in marketing terms. I should also market myself. So there's a book available. You can look at the empirical data over 10 years, how young Muslims' religious identity, unfortunately, is really showing a lot of degrees of foreclosedness, not exploratory, not matureness. Now we have to understand why this is the case. We have to reach out to these young people. So there are issues and problems. Where do we start is the key. And methodologically, we should problematize what is education in Islam, because we are doing all of this in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and in the name of Islam. From earliest education or from the Dar Ulum. Time has arrived to be transparent, to have benchmark and standards, just like the brother was talking about teaching Arabic. We should extend, isn't it, the same idea in the whole area of teaching Islam. Now this is a crucial point, because whenever we approach Islam, we should say, okay, what are our sources? I mean, there are some people out there, they say there is no such thing as Islamic education or even Muslimness, because everything depends on who you are and who you speak to. But this criticism aside, we have to be serious about, if we are going to develop an Islamically based educational model, we must substantiate ideas of this model within the core sources of Islam and Muslim tradition. That takes us back to the Quran, Sunnah, and Islamic tradition. Now that is the methodological issue. Because so many people who are interested in education, they are maybe experts in Islamic history or Islamic fiqh, or maybe other areas of Islam. But we have to now understand education itself is a science. We should approach Quran and Sunnah as educators. That has been my experience of the last 10 years. And it was, I assure you, it was a rewarding experience. When you begin to look at the Quran and Sunnah as an educator, then you appreciate the transformative educational model we have in the Quran and Sunnah. So the idea is, when you begin to reflect on what education is in Islam, isn't it? We have to look at the huge vocabulary of education in Islam. I'm sure most of you would know it. In my experience, I've come across several of these key concepts. For example, adab, ta'lim, isn't it? Tadris. You could have so many concepts. But the concept that I'm most interested, which did attract my attention, was Tarbiyah. Now this word is an interesting word. I don't know if some of you are Arabic speakers or some of you have maybe listened to me before. In this field, Islamic education, there are some scholars who suggest the word adab and adab to be the key concept to explain education. Because adab comes from Arabic word, essentially it means, it could mean of course to learn and to teach, but also it means moral disciplining, spiritual disciplining. And gradually it becomes ta'deeb, which is used in Turkish, in Urdu by the way, as a punishing concept by the way. When you say, I want to make you ta'deeb, isn't it? The idea is you are going to actually punish. So unfortunately the word adab has got this coercive control in it. And we have no time to go into details of this concept, but the concept originally, it is used in some of the ahadith. We know this. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to his own education, spiritual education, as adabani rabbi masalan. It means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has educated me spiritually. That means has taught me the revelation. But also, there's a very famous hadith. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam once told companions about the nature of the Quran, what Quran is. His metaphor was interesting, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said, Al-Quran ma'dabatullahi fil ard. Quran is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's, anybody know Arabic ma'duba? Which basically means, it's a banquet, isn't it? It's a banquet meal where you invite people to eat and benefit. So, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is actually offering an educational metaphor to describe what Quran is. Quran is ma'duba. It means it's a beautiful ready-made meal in order to be able to respond to all kinds of needs that we as human beings we have, spiritual, physical, mental, psychological. So whenever you go to a dinner party, isn't it, you will eat depending on your own interest, on your own hunger. So ma'duba, isn't it, will be person-centered. Quran actually is there to advise, guide us, isn't it, according to our level of need. So in this sense, adab is a very interesting concept, and later on it became associated with literature. So when you actually, the word adab means literature in Arabic today. That means if you are able to develop your competence of literacy in Arabic, that means you are taming your imagination. Because human imagination is made up of words, languages. That means you are a cultured person. In fact, some of you may know, the very famous scholar who sort of popularized this is Ibn Muqaffa, who actually was originally from Persia or India. He translated some of the Indian folklore to Arabic, and he created a prose, a beautiful Arabic prose. That means you develop etiquettes, adab, etiquettes and manners of being able to be a cultured person through language. Now, all of these things are very interesting, but unfortunately, ultimately in the long run, adab became the word for ethics, discipline. We also have a tradition of adab at-tahqiq. That means the etiquettes of verifying things in scientific way. So it's a beautiful concept. It requires reflection. But currently, unfortunately, adab is used as a moral coercion. And a very famous scholar who has popularized this is Professor Naqib al-Attas from Malaysia. You may read some of his book. His entire view of education in Islam based on this. Now, I humbly offer the critique of this, and I suggest the word tarbiyah to be the key concept. My reasons are as follows. First of all, linguistically. People who have obviously listened to me or looked at my book, they would know this. In word Arabic, tarbiyah, isn't it, comes from three possible roots. There are rabba yarubbu, rabba yarbu, or rabbi yarbu. That means increase, development, nurture, looking after, reform, and guide. So that means whenever we talk about the tarbiyah or education, there must be an element of care for the learner. Because who is learning, that is crucial. We are responding to the needs of the learner. So we are caring, we are trying to respond to their needs, nurturing, and that nurture should come out as a process of development in mental awareness, knowledge, spirituality, you name it. But then we're also guiding. Tarbiyah has also islah, the meaning of reform. So we are also at the same time trying to guide the learner for the best conduct. So the word tarbiyah, I realized, is one of the core concepts in which we have other concepts like adab, like tazkiyah, like ta'lim could come under. So I thought humbly maybe this word is a key. And when I looked at the Quran, of course, as we know, Rabbul Alameen, the word Rabb comes from the same root. So it was not an accident that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, describing his relationship with humanity with educational terms, rububiyyah. So Rabbul Alameen means the educator par excellence of the entire humanity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I am prepared to listen, to respond, and to guide. Through what? Through prayers, through revelation, through prophecy, all the rest of it. So the entire Islam, Quran, I realize, and Sunnah is based on this transformative element of Tarbiyah education. So Tarbiyah in many ways, it cannot be simple instruction, it cannot be simply moral coercion, it cannot be a simple power game. In order to be a proper Tarbiyah, it must facilitate growth, development, and guidance. If it's doing these three things, Tarbiyah is a transformative experience. Now, unfortunately today, it's difficult to find an Islamic educational context where young children or adults end up being transformed. This is the reality, unfortunately. But the key thing is because we have forgotten totally this Islamic heritage of critical education, transformative education. And without which I believe it's impossible to actually re-look at the way in which we introduce our values to young people, whose experiences are quite different, by the way. And also, we ourselves actually become agents of different capacities, like parents, teachers, murabbi, that means facilitators of growth, understanding, and knowledge. So in other words, we have one word, Tarbiyah, which in my view summarizes the entire transformative perspective on education. That is not confined to simply spiritual, devotional exercises, but also cognitive, psychological, and mental. There is an attempt to embrace human nature holistically. See, the word holistic makes sense now. Otherwise, it becomes like a lecturing sort of concept. Because Tarbiyah is a process, in fact, by the way, Tarbiyah is not classified as Tarbiyah Islamiyya or Tarbiyah this and that. No, Tarbiyah refers to the entire human experience. Essentially, it's an attempt to transform human condition for better. Now, when you look at it like this, you realize the entire Quran, for example, becomes actually a practical, transformative, divine pedagogies. Now, I have no time to explain this, because if our reading of Tarbiyah is correct, and if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is educated, we must have evidence in the Quran how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taught his own message. In turn, how Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was educated as a prophet, and he in turn taught Islam. You see, this must be very systematic and scientific. It cannot be simply based on our own whims and reflections. We have to find evidence for all of this. Now, I have humbly offered my model in my own book. I will just leave you with one metaphor to tell you how transformative this concept is if we really appreciate its meaning, if we come to terms with what it means as educators, as parents. This comes from a very famous hadith in Bukhari. Those of you who have studying, in Bukhari there's a famous hadith where Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam gives again, look, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's teaching has always been learner-centered. It's incredible. Just like the Quran is divine message, but is person-focused. Because the Quranic task is to change people, to change society. You cannot do this unless you have a very sophisticated pedagogic educational framework. We have to unpack this, and this is very crucial to come to terms with. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam says the Quran is just like a rain, ghayth, that comes down. So the imagery is, revelation is like rain, is like blessing. When the rain comes down, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, obviously it hits different types of earth, isn't it? Clays. So rain could be very fruitful, very nourishing, but if it hits into a very rocky ground, it can't do anything. What will happen? It will wash away. So, as Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, Quran, sometimes when you try to teach, make da'wah, it doesn't work. This should not make us despondent, lose spirit, because it's humans respond differently. But rain comes down and hits on a patchment of earth, half rocky, isn't it? The water is kept, but because the soil is not fertile, at least the water is kept. Some people will come and water their camels. There's some benefit. So it's good to have memorization. It's good to have, isn't it, remembering, recollection, but it is not the end point. The last point is, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, isn't it? He says the water comes in, hits a patchment of earth, which is quite fertile. It keeps the water, but it also works out the soil. And the soil facilitates growth of vegetation. Essentially, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is giving us as an example of how education should ultimately aim. It should not be a process of mindless memorizing only, mindless ritual, traumatic experiences that some of our young people go through in our madrasas, unfortunately. It must be a meaningful experience where the learner is given a chance to engage, no matter how small it is, so that the learner is transformed by it. The education becomes embodiment. It becomes something that translates into your life. If education is not doing this, it's not tarbiyah proper. It's something else. It's ideological brainwashing, it's indoctrination, it's instruction, you name it. But the Quranic tarbiyah says it should not be like this. It should nourish heart and souls. One more example from the Quran itself. The Quran, you will realize, will invite people to think about nature and past generations. And the Quran will always say this act of investigation, reflection, should lead into an educational outcome. What is it? The Quran will say, أَفَلَا يَسِيرُ فِي الْأَرْضِ لِتَكُونَ لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ يَفْقَهُونَ. Yeah? Try to investigate, think about the past civilizations. That inquiry, that reflection should produce itself, ultimately, giving you a competence that the Quran says, hearts capable of thinking, reflection. Not simply purely hearts, not pure spirituality. Devotion and reflection must go hand in hand so that human condition could be transformed. Now, I believe today, not only in the Islamic world, we have no time to engage examples in the Islamic world. Most of our social, economic, cultural problems, in my view, are unable to be transformed because Islamic world has not managed to fulfill the infrastructure, the actual educational reform itself. This cannot be done unless we go back and examine our own cultural roots. It's impossible, just like some of our rich Arab countries borrowing systems from America and Europe and expecting the same kind of output to come out. It will not work. Neither in Egypt nor in Qatar. They have done an experiment, and the reforms are telling us imitation will never lead into creation and innovation. We must make an attempt. We could be liberal, we could be secular, but Arab Islamic culture, Turkish culture, is embedded with Islamic motives. We have to reclaim this, and we have to rework out to the origins, without which no other reform, unfortunately, is going to work out. So I hope that in Muslim minority context in Europe, our situation is quite much more complicated. We must prioritize to make an attempt to reclaim this Islamic transformative education. We must prioritize investing in Muslim teacher training. This is, I've been saying this for 10 years now. We cannot simply open up new schools and every day. Who is going to run these schools? I don't mind, I don't care, because they are very proud. Our science, GCSEs, A-levels are very high. I want to see whether an Islamic school can teach properly Islam, can inculcate faith development, as well as science. There's no point in being proud of teaching only science, but we need to engage in enabling teaching of Islam itself. If we cannot do this, unfortunately, the entire future of Islam in Europe or European Islam may well be still delayed. So we have to prioritize education, we have to frame within a professional framework, and we have to create Islamic education as a subject recognized academically, an area of interdisciplinary research and professional development. If we cannot see this another 10, 20 years, we will not be able to reach our young people, and unfortunately, we cannot be agents of a mature articulation of Islam in Europe. جزاكم الله خير وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين